The war had ended 3 days earlier, but the battlefield had not yet learned what peace felt like. The banners had stopped burning, the horns of retreat had fallen silent, and the armies had begun their long march home. Yet the land itself still carried the scars of months of relentless fighting. Broken wagons lay scattered across muddy fields, shattered shields rested where exhausted hands had dropped them, and abandoned camps stretched toward the distant hills like ghosts refusing to disappear. Soldiers moved through the ruins in small groups, not searching for enemies anymore, but for survivors, missing companions, and anything worth salvaging before nature reclaimed it all. Captain Rowan Hale walked at the front of one such patrol, his weathered boots sinking into the damp earth with every step. He had survived battles that should have claimed him many times over, but victory did not feel the way stories promised it would. Every broken spear reminded him of someone who would never return home. Every abandoned sword belonged to a hand that would never lift it again. His men spoke little as they searched, understanding that silence sometimes honored the fallen better than words. A cold autumn breeze swept across the plain, carrying with it the scent of wet soil and extinguished campfires. Rowan paused beside what had once been the central command post of the Allied forces. The command tent had collapsed days ago, leaving behind splintered poles, torn canvas, scattered maps, and dozens of discarded supplies that no longer mattered now that peace had finally arrived. "Check everything," Rowan said quietly. "Leave nothing useful behind." His soldiers spread out immediately, carefully lifting crates, gathering blankets, collecting medical supplies, and stacking equipment that could still be repaired. Near the edge of the ruined camp sat an old steel helmet, half buried beneath mud and fallen cloth. It belonged to no one now. Rain had washed most of the dirt across its surface, leaving only faded scratches that hinted at how many battles it had survived. One young soldier named Ellis noticed it first. "Captain," he called. "Another helmet." Rowan barely looked up. "Throw it onto the wagon." Ellis bent down and reached for it, but the moment his fingers touched the rim, the helmet moved. He jumped backward so quickly he nearly fell into the mud. "Captain!" Several soldiers spun around instantly, hands flying toward their swords out of pure instinct. Rowan strode over, eyes narrowing. The helmet shifted again. Not because of the wind. Something inside it was moving. Every man froze. Slowly, carefully, Rowan crouched beside the helmet. He rested one hand on the rim and gently lifted it. What everyone expected to find was perhaps a frightened animal, or worse, one final battlefield trap left behind by retreating enemies. Instead, a tiny pair of silver-blue eyes blinked sleepily up at him. Curled tightly inside the helmet, wrapped in scraps of faded military cloth, slept the smallest dragon any of them had ever seen. It was barely larger than a house cat. Tiny silver scales reflected the pale morning sunlight, while soft sapphire-colored wings folded neatly around its body like a blanket. Its little tail was wrapped around its nose, and one tiny claw rested beneath its cheek exactly like a sleeping child. For several long seconds, nobody breathed. Ellis whispered first. "It's a baby." Rowan simply stared. The hatchling yawned. A tiny puff of harmless blue smoke escaped its nose before it stretched lazily, blinked twice, then looked directly into Rowan's face. Instead of fear, it made a tiny chirping sound. Then, as if deciding the large human looked comfortable enough, it reached both little front claws upward asking to be picked up. None of the soldiers had expected that. Ellis laughed despite himself. I think it likes you." Rowan hesitated. Dragons and humans had rarely stood on the same side during the war. Adult dragons had been powerful creatures. Some fought willingly beside kingdoms while others had remained fiercely independent. But everyone agreed on one thing. Dragon hatchlings were almost never seen by humans. They were protected fiercely by their families, which meant this tiny creature should never have been alone. Rowan slowly slid both hands beneath it. The hatchling weighed almost nothing. It curled instinctively against his chest before letting out a tiny sigh of contentment and immediately falling asleep again. The soldiers exchanged uncertain looks. "Where's its mother?" Ellis asked quietly. Nobody answered because nobody wanted to say the obvious possibility aloud. Rowan scanned the battlefield stretching toward the distant hills. No dragon circled overhead. No roar echoed across the valley. Nothing. Only silence. He looked back down at the sleeping hatchling nestled safely inside his arms. There were faint streaks of dried mud across its scales. One tiny wing carried a shallow scratch that had already begun healing. More troubling than that, however, was how thin the little dragon felt beneath its scales. It had not eaten properly for days. Rowan frowned deeply. "Search the area," he ordered. Carefully, the soldiers immediately spread out farther than before. They searched abandoned trenches, ruined supply wagons, collapsed towers, every corner of the battlefield. Hours passed beneath the autumn sun. They found broken weapons, lost letters, empty supply packs, even a forgotten horse that had wandered back toward the camp. But they found no adult dragons, no nest, no family, nothing that explained why the hatchling had survived alone inside an abandoned soldier's helmet. By late afternoon, the search was over. Ellis approached quietly. "Captain." Rowan looked up. Ellis lowered his eyes. "There's no one." Rowan already knew. He looked down at the sleeping dragon again. During the search, it had awakened briefly, accepted tiny pieces of dried meat soaked in warm water, then climbed straight back into his arms without hesitation. Now it slept peacefully against his chest, completely unaware that its entire world had disappeared. One older soldier removed his helmet respectfully. "Poor little thing." Another nodded. Maybe it climbed into the helmet because it was warm. Ellis swallowed hard. Or maybe it thought a soldier would come back for it. That possibility settled heavily over the group. Rowan closed his eyes briefly before opening them again with quiet determination. "We're leaving," he said. "But the hatchling comes with us." One soldier hesitated. "Captain, what if someone objects? Dragons belong with dragons." Rowan looked toward the empty battlefield stretching endlessly behind them. Then someone should have been here to take it home. No one argued after that. As the supply wagons rolled away from the battlefield toward the capital, the tiny dragon remained asleep inside Rowan's old steel helmet, which he had carefully lined with soft blankets before placing it beside him. Every so often the hatchling would peek over the rim, make sure Rowan was still nearby, and curl back into its strange little nest with complete trust. None of the soldiers noticed that tucked beneath the dragon's tiny body, hidden under the folds of cloth inside the helmet, lay a small silver pendant engraved with the royal crest of the Dragon Kingdom. A crest believed to have disappeared along with an entire dragon family during the final battle of the war. That forgotten pendant would soon reveal that the lonely hatchling sleeping peacefully inside an old soldier's helmet was not an ordinary dragon baby at all. It was the last surviving heir to a legacy that both humans and dragons believed had been lost forever. The journey back to the capital took 5 long days, and during every mile of that road, the tiny dragon refused to sleep anywhere except inside Captain Rowan Hale's old steel helmet. The soldiers quickly discovered that whenever someone tried to move the hatchling into a warmer basket or a softer bedroll, it would quietly climb back out, drag its tiny body across the wagon with surprising determination, and curl once again inside the dented helmet that had become its safe place. At first, the men laughed at the stubborn little creature, but before long, none of them questioned it anymore. The helmet had been the first shelter it had found after the war. Somehow, in its innocent heart, it had become home. Rowan often caught himself glancing toward the helmet during long stretches of silence. Every time he did, he found 2 bright silver-blue eyes watching him. The instant their gazes met, the hatchling would chirp happily before rolling over and falling asleep again, as if simply knowing he was nearby was enough. Ellis found the behavior amusing. "Captain," he joked one afternoon, "I think you've accidentally become its father." Several soldiers chuckled. Rowan shook his head with a faint smile he barely realized he was showing. "It simply remembers who picked it up." Ellis grinned. "Maybe. But I've tried feeding it 3 times today, and every time it looked at me first, then looked at you, like it was asking permission." Rowan said nothing. Secretly, he had noticed the same thing. The hatchling trusted the others enough to accept food or gentle pats on the head, but whenever it became frightened by loud noises or unfamiliar people, it ran directly toward him without hesitation. It was as though, after surviving unimaginable loneliness, it had chosen one person as its entire world. On the evening of the second day, heavy rain forced the company to stop beside an abandoned watchtower. The soldiers hurried to repair the leaking roof while Rowan carried the helmet inside, placing it carefully near the fire. The warmth quickly filled the stone room. One by one, the exhausted soldiers drifted to sleep. Rowan remained awake, quietly cleaning his sword while watching the flames dance. A tiny scratching sound interrupted the silence. He looked down. The hatchling had climbed out of the helmet and waddled toward him on unsteady little legs. Without making a sound, it climbed onto his boot, then onto his knee before curling into his lap. Rowan gently stroked the dragon's small head. "Can't sleep?" he whispered. The hatchling answered with a sleepy chirp before pressing its forehead against his hand. A faint blue glow shimmered beneath its tiny scales for only a heartbeat before fading again. Rowan frowned slightly. He had heard stories that young dragons glowed whenever they felt completely safe. He had never believed those tales until now. Ellis, who had been pretending to sleep, quietly smiled from across the room. "Looks like it's decided," he murmured. Rowan looked up. "Decided what?" Ellis shrugged. "That your family." Rowan opened his mouth to deny it, then stopped. The little dragon was already asleep again, holding one of his fingers with both tiny claws. Somehow, arguing felt pointless. The following afternoon, the company finally reached the capital's outer gates. Word of their victory had already spread, and hundreds of citizens lined the streets, cheering as soldiers marched through the city. Children waved flags. Bells rang from every church tower. Flowers covered the roads. It should have been a triumphant homecoming. Instead, everyone's attention quickly shifted toward the battered helmet resting in Rowan's arms. Tiny silver horns slowly appeared over the rim. Then two curious eyes peeked out. The hatchling blinked at the cheering crowd before ducking back inside the helmet with an embarrassed squeak. Laughter swept through the street. Not cruel laughter, but warm, delighted laughter. One little girl pointed excitedly. "Mama, the dragon is hiding." Her mother smiled through tears. "It's just a baby." Soon flowers were no longer being thrown only toward the returning soldiers. Some landed gently beside the helmet. The hatchling cautiously peeked out again. One bright yellow flower rested beside its nose. Curious, it sniffed the petals before sneezing. Instead of fire, dozens of glowing blue sparkles burst from its tiny nostrils, floating harmlessly through the air like fireflies. The children erupted into delighted applause. Even hardened veterans laughed openly. For the first time since the war had begun, genuine joy echoed through the capital. Yet inside the royal palace, the mood was very different. News traveled quickly. Before Rowan had even removed his armor, royal advisors requested an immediate audience. The throne room filled with generals, scholars, nobles, and members of the Royal Academy. Every eye focused on the tiny dragon still sleeping peacefully inside the old helmet. The king leaned forward thoughtfully. "Captain Hale," he said calmly, "tell us exactly where you found this creature." Rowan explained everything, from discovering the moving helmet to searching the battlefield without success. The room remained silent until he finished. Finally, an elderly scholar stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "there is something else." He pointed carefully toward the inside of the helmet. "May I?" Rowan nodded. The scholar gently lifted the sleeping hatchling just enough to examine the cloth beneath it. As he unfolded the fabric, something metallic slipped into his hand, a small silver pendant. The moment he saw its engraving, every trace of color disappeared from his face. His hands began trembling. "Impossible," he whispered. The king stood immediately. "Professor." The old scholar slowly turned the pendant so everyone could see it. Gasps echoed throughout the throne room. Etched into the silver was an ancient crest, a dragon with 6 outstretched wings surrounding a crown of stars. Every historian in the room recognized it instantly. The House of Asterion, the scholar whispered. The royal bloodline of the Dragon Kingdom. Silence crashed over the chamber. The Dragon Kingdom had fallen during the final months of the war. Every member of its royal family had reportedly died defending their mountain capital. There had been no survivors. At least, that was what history believed. The king stared at the sleeping hatchling. You're certain? The scholar nodded slowly. Only members of the royal dragon family carried this crest, and each pendant was enchanted to recognize its rightful heir. He hesitated before adding quietly, if this pendant remained with the hatchling, then... Rowan looked down at the tiny dragon sleeping peacefully against his arm, completely unaware that dozens of stunned faces now stared at it. Then what? He asked. The old scholar swallowed hard. Then this child is not simply a survivor. His voice became almost a whisper. Captain, you have unknowingly brought home the last living prince of the Dragon Kingdom. The room fell into absolute silence. But before anyone could speak again, the silver pendant suddenly began glowing with brilliant blue light, and the tiny dragon opened its eyes. It looked directly toward the enormous stained glass window overlooking the northern mountains, and let out a soft, heartbreaking cry, as though somewhere far beyond the horizon, someone it loved was still calling its name. The tiny dragon's sorrowful cry echoed through the throne room, lingering long after the sound itself had faded. No one moved. The brilliant blue light flowing from the silver pendant illuminated the polished marble floor, the ancient banners hanging from the walls, and the stunned faces of everyone gathered inside. Even the king remained speechless, his eyes fixed on the tiny hatchling that had unknowingly slept inside a battered soldier's helmet only hours before. Rowan instinctively held the little dragon closer, not because he feared anyone in the room, but because the hatchling suddenly looked so very small beneath the weight of a truth it could not possibly understand. The pendant continued glowing softly against its chest before the light slowly faded. The dragon blinked several times, looked around in confusion, and then buried its face against Rowan's armor as though frightened by all the unfamiliar attention. That single innocent movement shattered the tense silence. Ellis quietly cleared his throat. It doesn't even know who it is, he whispered. The elderly scholar nodded sadly. No, it only knows who kept it alive. Those words settled heavily across the chamber. The king slowly descended from his throne and walked toward Rowan, stopping only a few feet away. Instead of looking at the pendant, he looked directly at the frightened hatchling. How old would it be? He asked. The scholar studied the tiny dragon carefully. Perhaps 4 months, he answered. Far too young to remember titles, kingdoms, or politics. Rowan gently scratched beneath the dragon's chin, earning a tiny contented chirp that made several nobles smile despite the gravity of the situation. Then none of that matters to it, Rowan said quietly. Right now, it's just a baby. The king nodded thoughtfully. Exactly, but not everyone shared that gentle view. One noble advisor stepped forward, his expression stern. Your Majesty, he began cautiously. With respect, this changes everything. If this hatchling truly carries the blood of the Dragon Kingdom's royal family, news of its survival could ignite another war. Murmurs spread throughout the room. Another advisor added, there are kingdoms that would see the child as a symbol. Others would see it as a threat. Some would try to control it before it grows into an adult dragon. Rowan's jaw tightened. He looked down at the tiny creature asleep against his chest, its little claws still gripping the edge of his uniform. The idea of anyone viewing this helpless baby as a political weapon made something inside him burn with quiet anger. It's not a weapon, Rowan said firmly. It's a child. The advisor sighed. Captain, history rarely makes that distinction. The king raised one hand, silencing the growing debate. Enough. The room fell quiet immediately. He walked slowly around Rowan, studying the hatchling from every angle before speaking again. This dragon survived the greatest war our world has ever known. He paused. Not because it was powerful, but because someone showed it kindness. His eyes met Rowan's. That matters more than blood. Before anyone could respond, the great doors of the throne room suddenly opened. A messenger hurried inside, breathing heavily after what was clearly a desperate ride across the kingdom. He dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty!" The king frowned. "Rise. Speak." The messenger swallowed. "Scouts stationed in the northern mountains have reported dragons." Every head turned toward him. "How many?" the captain of the royal guard asked immediately. "5 adults." The messenger hesitated. "They've been flying in circles above the ruined dragon kingdom for 3 days. The elderly scholar's eyes widened. "Searching," he whispered. Rowan looked down at the little hatchling. The dragon had awakened again and was staring quietly toward the northern window, exactly as it had when the pendant first glowed. The scholar slowly stepped closer. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "I don't believe those dragons are preparing for war." The king folded his arms. "What do you believe?" The old man looked at the tiny dragon. "I believe they're searching for their lost prince." Silence followed. Rowan gently rubbed the dragon's back. It responded by leaning more heavily against him before letting out another quiet chirp toward the distant mountains. The sound was different this time, less sorrowful, more hopeful, almost as though it had heard something no human ears could detect. That evening, Rowan sat alone on the palace balcony overlooking the northern horizon. The little dragon rested inside its familiar helmet beside him, only its tiny horns visible above the rim. The city below celebrated peace with music and lanterns, but Rowan's thoughts remained fixed on the child sleeping nearby. He heard quiet footsteps behind him. The king approached without ceremony and stood beside him. For several minutes neither man spoke. Finally, the king broke the silence. "You know what happens if word spreads?" Rowan nodded. "People will come for it." "Yes." Another long silence followed. Rowan looked down at the sleeping hatchling. "Then don't tell anyone." The king smiled faintly. "I was hoping you'd say that." Rowan looked up in surprise. The king rested both hands on the stone railing. "History has already stolen this child's family." His voice became softer. "I refuse to let politics steal its childhood." Rowan felt an unexpected sense of relief. But before either man could say another word, the little dragon suddenly climbed out of the helmet and walked to the edge of the balcony. It stood on its tiny hind legs, looking toward the moonlit mountains far beyond the city. Then it spread its small sapphire wings. For several seconds, nothing happened. Suddenly, dozens of tiny blue lights drifted from its wings into the night sky. They floated upward like glowing feathers carried by the wind, rising higher and higher until they disappeared beyond the clouds. The scholar, who had quietly joined them moments earlier, gasped. "A royal beacon," he whispered. Rowan turned sharply. "What does that mean?" The old scholar watched the final blue light vanish over the northern horizon. His face had gone pale. Every member of the royal dragon family possessed one unique magical gift. He looked at the tiny hatchling with amazement. When separated from their kin, their hearts could call across impossible distances. Rowan's expression changed. "You're saying?" The scholar nodded slowly. "Somewhere beyond those mountains." His voice trembled slightly. "If even one member of the Royal Dragon Guard survived the war, they've just seen that light. Hundreds of miles away, deep within the frozen ruins of the Dragon Kingdom, 5 enormous dragons suddenly stopped flying. One by one, they lifted their heads toward the southern sky where dozens of tiny blue lights shimmered briefly above the clouds before fading into the stars. The oldest dragon closed his ancient golden eyes as tears silently rolled down his scarred face. "He's alive," he whispered. Without another word, the 5 dragons turned south and launched themselves into the night, beginning a journey that would change the future of both dragons and humans forever. The 5 royal dragons flew without rest, crossing frozen peaks, deep forests, and endless rivers beneath the cover of darkness. They ignored exhaustion, hunger, and the aching wounds that many of them still carried from the war. For months they had searched every battlefield, every ruined fortress, and every abandoned valley, refusing to believe that the last heir of the Dragon Kingdom had truly vanished. Many had urged them to surrender hope and accept that the royal bloodline had ended. They never did. The blue beacon that had risen into the night sky from the human capital was the answer they had prayed for through every lonely sunrise. By dawn on the third day, the lookout stationed on the northern towers of the capital spotted enormous shapes circling high above the clouds. Alarm bells echoed through the city. Citizens rushed indoors while soldiers hurried to the walls, believing another invasion had begun. Captain Rowan Hale climbed the eastern tower with the king at his side, the tiny dragon safely nestled inside its familiar steel helmet hanging from Rowan's shoulder. As the 5 dragons descended from the clouds, their massive wings cast moving shadows across the city below. Each bore the scars of the Great War, broken horns, torn wings, and faded battle markings. But despite their fearsome appearance, none prepared to attack. Instead, they landed together in the open meadow beyond the castle gates and lowered their heads in complete silence. It was not the posture of conquerors. It was the posture of guardians waiting for permission. The king looked toward Rowan. "Bring him," he said quietly. Rowan nodded and walked through the opened castle gates alone, carrying the old helmet in both hands. Hundreds of soldiers watched nervously from the walls, arrows ready but lowered. The 5 dragons never looked at the humans. Their golden eyes remained fixed on the little helmet. Rowan stopped several paces away and gently placed it on the grass. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then 2 tiny silver-blue eyes peeked over the rim. The hatchling blinked curiously at the enormous dragons before letting out a cheerful little chirp, completely unaware of the importance of the moment. The oldest dragon, a magnificent silver guardian with weathered scales and countless scars, closed his eyes as tears rolled freely down his face. Very slowly, he lowered his enormous head until his forehead touched the earth before the tiny hatchling. One by one, the other 4 dragons did the same. The soldiers watching from the walls stood in stunned silence. Ellis whispered, "They're bowing." The elderly scholar beside him nodded, unable to hide his own tears. "Not to a king," he murmured. "To the child they promised to protect." The little dragon tilted its head in confusion before climbing clumsily out of the helmet. It waddled across the grass on tiny legs toward the enormous silver dragon. Rowan instinctively took half a step forward, worried the hatchling might be frightened. Instead, the baby reached up with both little paws and gently touched the old guardian's nose. The ancient dragon let out a deep, rumbling sound unlike anything the humans had ever heard. It wasn't a roar. It sounded almost like someone crying with relief. The other dragons answered with the same low melody until the entire valley echoed with it. The tiny hatchling chirped happily and wagged its tail, believing it had simply made new friends. The oldest guardian finally lifted his gaze toward Rowan. Though dragons and humans spoke different tongues, the ancient creature slowly lowered his head once more, pressing it respectfully toward the captain. The scholar gasped softly. "He's thanking you." Rowan swallowed hard. "I only picked him up." The scholar smiled through misty eyes. "No, Captain. You gave him back his future." The king stepped forward beside Rowan, lowering his sword and removing the royal crown from his own head as a gesture of peace. "The child is safe," he said calmly. "He has been our guest, not our prisoner." Although the dragons could not understand every word, they understood the sincerity behind them. The oldest guardian slowly unfolded one enormous wing and revealed a weathered leather pouch secured beneath it. Inside lay dozens of small keepsakes recovered after the final battle. A tiny royal blanket, a silver feeding cup, several family emblems, and a faded painting showing a smiling dragon queen gently holding a newborn hatchling with bright silver-blue eyes. Rowan looked down at the baby standing beside him. It was the same child. The little dragon stared at the painting for several long moments. Then, as if some distant memory stirred deep within its heart, it softly pressed one tiny paw against the painted face of its mother. A quiet whimper escaped its throat. Without hesitation, Rowan knelt beside the hatchling and gently rested one hand on its back. The baby immediately leaned against him. The old guardian watched this with calm understanding. He did not seem jealous or offended. Instead, he gave a slow, approving nod. The The scholar quietly smiled. "Love does not replace love," he whispered. "It simply grows." The king turned toward the ancient guardian. "Will you take him home?" he asked softly. The dragon looked toward the distant northern mountains before looking back at the tiny hatchling, who had now curled against Rowan's leg while clutching the old steel helmet with both tiny claws. After a long pause, the guardian slowly shook his head. Everyone stared in surprise. The scholar blinked. "He doesn't want to force the child." Rowan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The scholar watched the dragons carefully. "The prince is too young to understand kingdoms or duty. Right now, this soldier is the only family he remembers." Tears filled Ellis's eyes as he looked at the little dragon hiding partly behind Rowan's boot. The ancient guardian carefully nudged the battered helmet toward Rowan with one enormous claw before stepping back. It was a gift and a promise. The guardian was saying that the child's heart should decide when it was ready to return. Months passed peacefully after that remarkable meeting. The 5 royal dragons built a sanctuary high in the mountains but visited the capital often. They never demanded the prince's return. Instead, they allowed him to grow surrounded by both dragons and humans, learning compassion from one family and courage from the other. Rowan remained his constant guardian. Every evening, despite having a magnificent royal nest waiting whenever he wished, the little dragon still climbed into the same dented steel helmet that had once protected him on a lonely battlefield. It had become more than a helmet. It was the first place where an orphan hatchling had felt safe after losing everything. Years later, when peace between dragons and humans was stronger than anyone had believed possible, children often laughed whenever they heard the famous story of how a mighty dragon prince had once refused golden beds because he preferred sleeping inside an old soldier's battered helmet. But the adults understood the deeper truth. The helmet had never been important because it was made of steel. It was important because kindness had filled it first. Long after Captain Rowan had grown old, that weathered helmet was placed inside the Hall of Peace beside a simple inscription that every visitor stopped to read. "Wars may be ended by victory, but peace begins when someone chooses to protect the smallest survivor left behind." And beneath those words rested the tiny silver pendant of the Dragon Kingdom and the battered soldier's helmet. 2 treasures that together reminded generations that the greatest heroes are not always those who win battles, but those who kneel in the mud, lift up the forgotten, and carry them home.